More US weapons for Israel than ever before. A new $38 billion deal is the biggest ever signed in Washington with one country. But why does Israel still need US military aid? And how does it affect the delicate balance of power in the Middle East? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Adrian Finighan. It is the biggest promise of US military aid given to any country, and it's going to Israel. The new Memorandum of Understanding is with the closest US ally in the Middle East. It's being signed 4 months before Barack Obama leaves office, ensuring some certainty for Israeli politicians before the next president of the US is sworn in. Obama's aides see the weapons deal as an important part of his legacy. Critics of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu say that he could have secured more money if he'd had a better relationship with the White House. Despite that, the message to Israel's foes is clear. The US remains a major supporter and will continue to be well into the future. The $38 billion will be distributed over 10 years, starting in 2019. It's significantly less than the $45 billion that Netanyahu initially asked for. The deal also includes other Israeli concessions, including a bar on asking for additional money from Congress, which was allowed in previous deals, and it phases out Israel's ability to spend US money on Israeli-made weapons rather than US arms. We'll speak to our guests about the deal in just a moment, but first, Imran Khan has more for us from Jerusalem.
The reaction here to this landmark deal can really be divided into two. There are those that say that this is the best deal that Israel could get, that it's a landmark deal for Israel, that it's more than any other state has ever been pledged in history, and that given the US's financial position, it's something that should be appreciated, that the US is showing such support for Israel. There are detractors to this deal. They say that they could have been able to get more. Some $42 billion is a figure that's being bandied around. They say that if the relationship between Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and President Barack Obama wasn't so fraught, that they would have been able to get more. There's also real concern that the money can only be spent on American military projects and American military hardware, that in previous agreements, Israel has been able to spend 25% on its own military development. So that's a concern. The real thing that both sides can agree on, both narratives are both saying, is that this sends a message to the rest of the region that Israel is the military superior to everybody else, and this sends a message saying that America is firmly committed, despite public disagreements, is firmly committed to Israel's security.
All right, so let's bring in our guests for today's discussion. From London, we're joined by Yossi Mekelberg, a professor of international relations at Regents University. From Amman, we're joined by Mouin Rabbani, who is the co-editor of the online magazine Jadaliyyaonline. And from Washington, D.C., we have Thomas Pickering with us. He's a former US Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs and a former ambassador to Israel. Mossi, let's start with you. What do you make of this agreement? $3.8 billion a year over 10 years.
You can read into this quite a lot and different things. Considering the frosty relations between Obama and Netanyahu, one might regard it as an achievement. However, had Netanyahu probably played these cards right, it could have been even a better deal. I think on the bigger picture, it shows US commitment to the long-term Israeli security, but it's also a message that there is plenty of uneasiness regarding this specific government. And I think this is one of the conundrums for any American administration when there is a government in Israel that it disagree quite fundamentally in an issue so important as the Israeli-Palestinian one, or the Iran nuclear issue, between the long-term support and full commitment to the well-being and security of Israel and its military superiority, but at the same time, how it can influence it to change its policy on things that are so significant for American interests.
Mouin Rabbani, what do you make of it?
It's quite extraordinary, this deal. The U.S. has now provided the largest military aid package in its history, not only to a state that is not a formal strategic ally, the way you would think of, for example, members of NATO, and to a state that is systematically violating international law, most prominently, of course, in its relationship with the Palestinian people, but perhaps more importantly for the purposes of this discussion, is providing this aid to an Israeli government that has lost no opportunity to undercut and try to frustrate American policy, not only with respect to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but also to other U.S. Middle East policy, most prominently the Iranian nuclear agreement, and an Israeli government that has launched unprecedented interference in the domestic American policy process. So the political message that this basically sends, I think, to this and future Israeli governments is act as you please, there will be no consequences, or rather, the only consequences will be rewards and further encouragement. So in that respect, it's extremely disappointing to see the scale with which Israel has gotten away with its policies. And I completely agree with the previous speaker. The only reason that this deal is not even more to Israel's interests is because of missteps, if you will, on the Israeli side, rather than an American unwillingness to go even further.
Mouin, you raised some interesting points. We'll pick up on those a little later in the discussion, but I want to pin down something first with Thomas Pickering in Washington. Ambassador, why does Israel need $3.8 billion, a whopping amount of money, every year in military aid?
Well, first let me, for reasons of balance, also point out I was an ambassador to Israel and ambassador to the United Nations at various times in my career. Secondly, let's look at the deal. And the $3.8 billion is a negotiated figure inside the deal. The U.S. has been committed for a long period of time to Israel's qualitative military edge. You may agree with it and you may not agree with it, but that is a measure that is helping to define the deal. The deal in itself is interesting inside the deal. You mentioned, in fact, that there are certain changes. It's also important to measure that the current level is $3.1 billion, plus on an average of $500 million in addition for ballistic missile defense in Israel. That takes it to 3.6. If I can do maths, and I was never a math great, that's about 4.8% increase over 10 years, which is not, in my view, a generous new, put it this way, encomium of largesse on the Israeli government. And it reflects what the other two distinguished speakers have had to say, that Obama has worked hard in his own way to take into account what he feels to be Israel's legitimate and maybe some beyond security needs in putting this deal together. The interesting thing about the deal, as in all of these deals in my experience, there are no other further requirements beyond the military, probably for good reason, but nevertheless they're important. And as Mouin has said, you have a government that has not played what I would call the active, useful, and cooperative role in the peace process that John Kerry and Barack Obama expected. You have on the Palestinian side, obviously much weaker and much more divided, still some sense of concern that they have missed opportunities rather than taken them in this deal. The deal, final point, is touching on 5 or 6 major questions. U.S.-Israel relations, probably okay. The next American election, probably all right for Hillary, but not what I would call big. But it is not, in my view, going to influence either her financial support here or voter attitudes. U.S.-Iran, certainly it takes into account something that Bibi Netanyahu has very much in mind, but which I think the nuclear deal with Iran pretty much solves
All right.
for 15 years. And so I wouldn't worry about that. The peace process, which we've talked about, and relations in the region, all of which I think are open for further discussion here.
Ambassador, I mean, yeah, indeed, open for discussion, but you still didn't answer, or I just don't think you did answer the initial question.
I said 3.8 is
Yeah.
a negotiated figure based on qualitative military edge, which is
Right.
anybody's judgment. That's what the military people have agreed to. It reflects, obviously, a keen eye to the other five
Okay.
or six things that I mentioned. We can't in any way at all put a figure on those, but it's important to know that it is negotiated, it is careful, it is conservative,
Okay.
but it is not huge.
Yossi Mekelberg, what did you make of what you heard there?
I agree with Ambassador Pickering that the increase as such is not huge. It is around $200 million a year. But and I agree that U.S. commitment to Israel long-term security, as shown by this agreement, is set in the agreement, set in stone. The question for American foreign policy, and in many ways Obama makes this commitment for the next 2.5 terms of presidents, how they are going to ensure that American interests, as for instance was defined by Obama himself vis-a-vis the peace process, is going to be achieved. Now, there is no easy answer to this. How on the one hand you ensure that Israel has military superiority, which is already it has, and how you ensure it in the next 10, in this case is until 2029, so it means for the next 13 years. But at the same time that the United States manages also to have an influence on the way that Israeli governments behave. Bear in mind, this is going to feed in the Israel political system, and Netanyahu, and rightly so, might go and say, you see, I stood up to Obama about Iran. Maybe I failed, but it didn't affect the way the support of the United States. I didn't say what he will say didn't cave in on the Israeli-Palestinian, and still I got $38 billion in military aid. So it might also strengthen certain elements in Israeli politics, which I'm not so sure that's what the current administration wanted to do. And how they
right.
settle this, square these circles is a good question.
Mouin Rabbani, do you want to come back on anything that you've heard? I'm interested to know what sort of message you think this sends to the US's allies in the region, Jordan and Egypt in particular.
I think that's a more complex question because, as you're no doubt aware, we're no longer in a region where one can speak simply of Israel on the one hand and the Arab states on the other. Secondly, much of the Arab world is in increasing turmoil and in a situation in which the Arab-Israeli conflict is not really on the agenda, or at least not high on the agenda. And thirdly, of course, you have the factor that certain Arab states, particularly in the Gulf, have prioritized their rivalry with Iran over what used to be an adversarial relationship with Israel, in some cases to the extent that they see Israel as a partner or ally in their struggle with Iran. But more specifically, regarding Jordan and particularly Egypt, there is, I believe, and Mr. Pickering can correct me if I'm wrong, congressional legislation which ties the volume of American military assistance to Egypt to the level of American military assistance to Israel. So Egypt may, in this respect, be a net beneficiary because a proportion of the benefits that would accrue to Israel, by definition, will subsequently accrue to Egypt.
Well, it took 10 months of negotiations to reach this deal, underscoring the tense relationship between President Obama and Prime Minister Netanyahu. As you've heard, they disagree on several issues, including the Iran nuclear deal signed by the US last year and the continuing construction of Israeli settlements in the occupied West Bank. Critics say that Netanyahu could have secured more money if his relationship with Obama had been stronger. But despite the tension, Netanyahu chose to finalize the deal with President Obama now, before the White House welcomes a new president early next year. Ambassador Pickering, last month the White House toughened the language that it uses to condemn what it sees as quote, a dramatic escalation in Israeli building in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. Is Israel being rewarded for bad behavior with this deal?
I think that you can make that case, but you have to understand that the tradition here has been that the military is a military deal, and within its four corners, the arrangements relate to the military position, the expectations in the region in terms of threats, and the arguments about individual military systems that will one way or another have to be paid for inside the deal. The deal is in some ways, I suppose, latent leverage, but it is not in any way at all in this situation something that involves a quid pro quo. Rather the opposite. It is attempting to take it out of what I would call the back and forth over the peace settlement, over Iran, over the position in the region. That has been the tradition for a long period of time, recognizing that the political ramifications, particularly in the United States, of, in fact, if I could put it this way, putting Israel's security on the block in connection with a set of negotiations or thoughts about the future. That takes us to the very important question, is it tied to Egypt and Jordan? Not to Jordan specifically. Is it tied to Egypt? As part of the Egyptian-Israeli peace settlement, there was an agreement on ratios. My sense is that that has long gone by the boards and is not something that the U.S. feels it's engaged to Egypt to maintain, that the settlement with Egypt in respect to any military assistance there will come out of a U.S.-Egyptian discussion. But it is important to think that this question now sets the stage for whether or not Obama, as many hope and expect, but at this point don't have great hopes, will use the lame duck period to move ahead with something, a speech, a production of principles, a taking of those principles to the UN Security Council, all very long range, but all likely in one way or another to be very, very important in setting the future parameters for the region, and something that clearly at this stage is highly unlikely before the election, but the lame duck period between the election and January 20th may present that kind of opportunity. Okay. It is also clear that Prime Minister Netanyahu seems to be very worried about that possibility.
Professor Mekelberg, why do you think Israel chose, given what the ambassador was saying there, chose to tie this deal down now rather than waiting for a new, who knows, perhaps even more Israel-friendly president next year?
Well, I think the uncertainty in the American political system right now, it's enough to see what happened in the last few days. I think they rather take what is on the table than wait for another administration and start negotiating all over again. There are some good aspects from Israel's point of view for this deal. It's some increase. There are some problematic, I think, ignoring the fact that Israel won't be able to use like 25-26% of the money in Israel will probably harm the Israeli arms industry. And I think from the American point of view, it will help American arm industry because they like the cooperation between the two industry and the two militaries. But I think they rather take the deal that was on the table than wait to a new president, especially when it seems to be so unpredictable. I also agree that in this sense, Egypt is not part of the deal because what was signed 40 years ago is less and less relevant, considering that even Israel wanted to change elements that looked completely taboo only 5-6 years ago of having Egyptian troops in the Sinai Peninsula. All of a sudden, Israel and Egypt cooperating on security issue in the Sinai Peninsula. Time goes on, and with that also the parameters of security. If I may, only one more point. Okay. The difference between the deal, what looks 30 years ahead, and look at security from the point of view of the decision-making compared to what is now on the table makes the imbalance of what you see that is needed from a political point of view, relations between two administrations and long-term relations between two states. Okay. And that's that's always the issue when you look in such long-term agreements.
Mouin Rabbani, we've talked about Iran several times in this discussion. With Iran now having been brought back in from the cold, do the security threats that Israel says that it faces warrant this amount of money in military aid?
If you were to ask most objective analysts and nuclear specialists, the almost uniform conclusion that they've reached is that the Iranian nuclear agreement is actually a strategic advantage for Israel in the sense that it lays to rest any concerns Israel may have had about the further development of an Iranian military nuclear program for at least the next decade or two, if not beyond. And it's really, given the intrusiveness of the inspection regime and all the rest of it. So you now have this, I would say, rather bizarre situation where this new military aid package is, at least in part, perceived, if not in actuality, compensating Israel for an agreement that in fact meets certain core Israeli strategic interests in the region. And I think that's probably the clearest answer I can give you. Once again, Israel is being compensated for something it's been given rather than for something that's been taken away from it.
Ambassador Pickering, what does this deal do for President Obama's legacy, and will it mollify his Republican critics at home who've accused him of falling far short on Israel?
The answer to the last part is no. The answer to the first part is he certainly hopes so. The statements about this is the largest, the most generous, and so on are all designed, obviously, particularly in the American election context, but also in what I would call the legacy fashioning period of the administration, things that are designed to put on the record that Obama believes he's been the most generous, the most open-hearted, the most favorable U.S. president in support of Israel in history. And there are some reasons to believe that that is the case. This agreement is not what I would call a lavish new increase. On the other hand, a 10-year agreement with certainty, except perhaps for totally unforeseen circumstances that it's hard to even think about, remains something that Israelis can count upon. And as Mr. Rabbani said, the military justifications for this deal are basically the same as they've always been: continued uncertainty in the region and a commitment by the United States to a status for Israeli security that is classified in superlatives, qualitative military edge. It means over any individual state in the region, over any combination of states. And it is true that this deal comes after the Iran agreement, which I very much see as a gift to Israel, and several hundred Israeli military and intelligence experts seem to have agreed to that, contrary to the views of the Prime Minister of Israel on this particular question. So it plays a big role, if I could put it this way, in American domestic political life, as arrangements with Israel always do.
Ambassador, I'm sorry to cut you short. We're rapidly running out of time. I just want a very, very quick, and it has to be quick, Mouin. We've got 30 seconds here, answer from you. The largest pro-Israel lobbying group said this deal is going to send a strong message of deterrence to Israel's enemies. Does it?
Well, I guess the question is, how many enemies does Israel have left in the region that need to be deterred? They can basically be counted on the fingers of one hand, if not less. And those who are still thoroughly opposed to Israel and its policies are not going to be deterred by a 10-year military agreement between the United States and Israel.
Gentlemen, there, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it. We're out of time. Thank you very much indeed for being with us. Yossi Mekelberg in London, Mouin Rabbani in Amman, and Thomas Pickering in Washington. As always, thank you for watching. Don't forget you can see our programme again at any time just by going to aljazeera.com. For further discussion on this, go to our Facebook page at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story, or you can join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle, AJ Inside Story. From me, Adrian Finighan, and the whole team here in Doha, thanks for watching. We'll see you again. Bye for now.